The rifle crack split the Arizona morning air, and Lily Stanton dropped the coyote before it could get within 20 feet of her henhouse, her hands steady as stone despite the fury raging in her chest. She lowered the Winchester and stared at the dead animal without satisfaction, feeling nothing but the familiar emptiness that had become her constant companion since the day they brought Thomas home draped over his saddle, 3 bullets in his back from a card game gone wrong. That had been 2 years ago in the spring of 1882, and now here she stood in the autumn of 1884, 24 years old and already feeling ancient, her heart a dried-up well in the scorching desert that surrounded her small ranch outside Gila Bend. The town of Gila Bend sat in the Sonoran Desert of Arizona Territory like a collection of weathered bones, a stopping point for travelers heading west and a harsh home for those stubborn enough to stay. Lily had been one of those travelers once, full of hope and dreams when she arrived as Thomas's bride at 19. Now those dreams lay buried alongside her husband in the small cemetery on the hill, and all that remained was work, survival, and a bitterness that coated everything like the dust that perpetually covered her windows. She bent to grab the coyote by its hind legs, dragging it away from the chicken coop. Her dark blonde hair, once carefully pinned and pretty, hung in a simple braid down her back, practical and plain. She wore men's trousers under her skirt, something that scandalized the church ladies but kept her alive when she had to ride or work. The ranch was small, just 40 acres with a handful of cattle, some chickens, and a vegetable garden she fought to keep alive in the unforgiving soil. Thomas had big plans once, plans to expand, to build something lasting. But Thomas was gone, and Lily had learned that plans were just pretty lies people told themselves before life came along to prove them wrong. She was washing blood from her hands at the pump when she heard the hoofbeats. Her eyes narrowed as she reached for the rifle she'd propped against the fence post, but she relaxed slightly when she saw it was just Xavier Ingram, the cowboy who worked the neighboring spread. She'd seen him around town and at the general store, always polite, always keeping his distance like everyone else did around the bitter widow. He was perhaps 27 or 28, tall and lean the way men got when they spent their lives working cattle under the sun, with brown hair that needed cutting and eyes that were an unusual shade of amber in the right light. "Morning, Mrs. Stanton," he called, stopping his horse a respectful distance away. His voice was low and calm, the kind of voice that probably soothed skittish horses. "Heard the shot. Everything all right, Coyote," she said curtly, nodding toward the dead animal. "I handled it. I can see that." He dismounted slowly, movements deliberate and unthreatening. "Mind if I take it off your property? The hide's still good," she shrugged. "Take it." He walked over to the carcass, and she noticed he had a slight limp favoring his left leg. An old injury, probably, the kind every cowboy collected like other men collected pocket watches. He hoisted the coyote easily despite the limp, securing it behind his saddle. When he turned back to her, there was something in his expression that made her defensive, though she couldn't quite name what it was. Concern, maybe, or pity. She hated both equally. "Your fence has some posts down on the eastern edge," he said. "Saw them on my way over. If you want, I could come by tomorrow and help repair them." "I can fix my own fences," Lily said sharply. "Didn't say you couldn't." His tone remained even, unbothered by her hostility. "Just offering help if you want it. No obligation either way. I don't need charity." Wasn't offering charity. He adjusted his hat, those amber eyes steady on hers. Was offering neighborly help, the kind people give and receive around here. But if you'd rather handle it alone, that's your right. She wanted to snap at him again, to drive him away with her anger like she'd driven away everyone else who'd tried to help in the past 2 years. But something about his calm manner, the complete lack of judgment or pity in his face, made the words stick in her throat. Instead, she just gave a curt nod. "I'll think about it." "Fair enough." He mounted his horse with practiced ease despite the limp. "You know where the Ross Ranch is if you change your mind. Good day, Mrs. Stanton." He rode off without looking back, and Lily stood watching him go, irritated with herself for reasons she couldn't quite articulate. She didn't want help, didn't want conversation, didn't want anything but to be left alone with her bitterness and her grief. Those had become comfortable companions, familiar in their weight. The thought of letting them go felt like losing the last piece of Thomas she had left. The day wore on as days did, a relentless march of chores and heat and solitude. She fed the chickens, tended the garden, checked on the cattle grazing in the scrub brush, and tried not to think about the fence posts or Xavier Ingram's offer. By evening, she was exhausted in body but restless in mind, a combination she'd grown used to over the past 2 years. She ate a cold supper of beans and cornbread, not bothering to light the stove for a proper meal. What was the point of cooking when there was no one to share it with? The next morning dawned hot and bright, as mornings always did in Gila Bend. Lily woke before sunrise, dressed in her practical clothes, and headed out to check the fence line before the day grew too warm. She told herself she was just doing her normal rounds, not specifically going to look at the eastern edge where Xavier had mentioned the down posts. But her feet carried her there anyway, and she had to admit he'd been right. 3 posts had rotted through at the base and collapsed, taking a section of wire fencing with them. It was fixable, but it would take time and effort she'd been putting off. She was examining the damage when she heard hoofbeats again. This time she recognized the sound of Xavier's horse, a dappled gray gelding with white socks. Part of her wanted to be angry at his presumption, but another part, a part she tried hard to ignore, felt something like relief. "Morning," he called, and she noticed he'd brought supplies with him, fresh fence posts, wire, tools. "Figured you might be out here checking the damage." "I was about to start repairs," she said, which wasn't exactly true, but she didn't want him thinking she'd been waiting for him. "Good. 2 sets of hands make lighter work." He dismounted and started unloading his supplies without waiting for permission. Lily opened her mouth to protest, then closed it again. What would be the point? He was already here, already helping, and fighting him would just waste time and energy. They worked in silence for the first hour, digging out the rotted posts and preparing the holes for new ones. Xavier worked with the efficient economy of movement that came from years of hard labor, and Lily had to admit he knew what he was doing. Not that she would say as much out loud. The sun climbed higher, turning the desert into a furnace, and sweat soaked through both their shirts. "Water?" Lily finally asked, more because it was practical than because she wanted conversation. "Appreciate it." She walked back to the house and filled a jug from the pump, carrying it back along with 2 tin cups. They sat in the meager shade of a mesquite tree, drinking in silence. Lily studied him from the corner of her eye, noting the way he moved carefully when shifting his left leg, the old injury clearly still bothering him. "How'd you hurt your leg?" The question surprised her as much as it probably surprised him. She wasn't usually one for personal inquiries. He looked down at his leg as if he'd forgotten about the injury. "Bull got me about 3 years back, threw me into a fence post and shattered the bone pretty good, healed crooked. You're lucky it healed at all. That's the truth." He took another drink, then looked at her directly. "Your husband, Thomas Stanton, I heard about what happened. I'm sorry for your loss." Lily's whole body tensed. "Everyone's sorry. Sorry doesn't bring him back." "No, it doesn't," Xavier agreed quietly. Nothing brings back the dead, but being angry at the living won't change that either. You don't know anything about what I feel, Lily said, her voice sharp as broken glass. You're right, I don't. He stood slowly, careful with his leg. But I know something about loss, about anger, and I know that carrying it alone just makes the burden heavier. He walked back to the fence line and resumed work, leaving Lily sitting under the mesquite tree with her thoughts churning like storm clouds. Who was he to speak to her about loss? What did this cowboy know about watching your whole future die in a single moment? She wanted to be furious with him for his presumption, but his words had struck something deep inside her, something she'd buried under layers of bitterness and rage. She joined him at the fence, working without speaking. By midday, they had 2 of the 3 posts replaced and were starting on the final one. The work was hard and hot, but there was something almost meditative about it, the simple rhythm of physical labor drowning out the constant noise in her head. "Why are you doing this?" she asked suddenly. "Helping me, I mean. You barely know me." Xavier tamped dirt around the final post, testing its stability before answering. "Does there need to be a reason beyond it being the right thing to do? Most people want something in return. I'm not most people." He straightened, wiping sweat from his forehead. "And I'm not asking for anything you're not willing to give." There was no judgment in his tone, no expectation, just simple honesty. Lily found herself unsettled by it in ways she couldn't quite explain. She'd grown so accustomed to people's pity, to their carefully worded condolences and the way they tiptoed around her grief. Xavier did none of that. He treated her like a person, not a tragedy, and she didn't know quite how to respond. They finished the fence by early afternoon, and Xavier refused her offer of a meal in payment, though she could tell he was hungry. He just mounted his horse, tipped his hat, and rode off with the same quiet patience he'd shown all morning. Lily watched him go, then turned to survey the repaired fence. It stood straight and strong, a marked improvement over the rotted posts. She should feel satisfied by the completion of the task, but instead, she just felt strangely hollow. The days turned into weeks, and autumn deepened across the desert. The brutal summer heat eased into something almost pleasant, and the mesquite trees turned gold in the slanting sunlight. Lily fell back into her solitary routine, but she found herself noticing things she'd overlooked before. The way the light hit the mountains at sunset, the sound of her chickens clucking contentedly, the surprising sweetness of the tomatoes from her garden. Small things, unimportant things, but they penetrated the fog of bitterness she'd wrapped around herself like a shield. Xavier came by twice more over those weeks, always with a practical reason. Once to warn her about a cougar spotted in the area, and once to help her round up some cattle that had wandered onto Ross property. He never stayed longer than necessary, never pushed for conversation, never looked at her with pity or expectation. His patience was like water wearing away stone, so gradual she barely noticed it happening. It was late October when Lily rode into Gila Bend for supplies. The town was small, just a single main street with a general store, a saloon, a church, and a handful of other buildings that served the scattered population of ranchers, miners, and travelers. She tied her horse outside Morrison's general store and steeled herself for the inevitable encounters. People in small towns meant well, but their well-meaning had driven her to avoid town as much as possible. Mrs. Morrison greeted her with the usual mixture of sympathy and curiosity. "Lily dear, how are you managing out there all alone? We worry about you, you know." "I manage fine," Lily said, keeping her voice neutral as she began gathering her supplies: flour, sugar, coffee, ammunition for her rifle. "It's just not natural, a young woman living alone like that. You should think about moving back to town, maybe taking a room at the boarding house. Or better yet, there are several fine men who would be honored to. I'm not interested in remarrying. Lily cut her off firmly. This was a conversation they'd had before, and she had no patience for it today. Mrs. Morrison pursed her lips disapprovingly but didn't press further. Lily paid for her supplies and was loading them into her saddlebags when she heard raised voices from the direction of the saloon. She tried to ignore them, keeping her focus on securing her purchases, but then she heard a name that made her blood freeze. Thomas Stanton was a damn fool and a cheat, and he got what he deserved. The voice belonged to Jack Riley, one of the men who'd been playing cards the night Thomas was killed. He'd claimed self-defense, said Thomas had drawn first, and the law had believed him. There'd been no trial, no justice, just her husband in a pine box and Jack Riley walking free. Lily had seen him around town since then, always avoiding him, always swallowing her rage because what else could she do? The law had spoken. The matter was closed. But hearing him disparage Thomas's memory, hearing him call her husband a cheat and a fool, something inside her snapped. She stormed toward the saloon, barely aware of what she was doing. Riley stood on the wooden walkway outside, laughing with two other men, a bottle of whiskey dangling from his hand. He was a big man, thick through the middle and mean-eyed, with a reputation for violence that should have given her pause. But rage had drowned out caution. "You take that back," Lily demanded, her voice shaking with fury. "You killed my husband and now you stand there lying about him." Riley turned, his face flushing red when he saw her. "Well, if it isn't the widow Stanton. Still bitter, I see. Your husband drew on me, woman." "Not my fault he was slow. He would never have drawn first. You murdered him." "Careful with your words," Riley said, his voice dropping to something dangerous. "Calling a man a murderer is serious business, especially when the law already ruled otherwise. The law was wrong." Riley took a step toward her, and Lily's hand instinctively went to the small pistol she kept in her jacket pocket. But before the confrontation could escalate further, a familiar voice cut through the tension. "That's enough, Riley." Xavier stepped between them, positioning himself with his back to Lily and his eyes fixed on Riley. His voice was calm but carried an edge that suggested crossing him would be unwise. "The lady's upset. You've said your piece. Time to move along." "This ain't your business, Ingram," Riley growled. "I'm making it my business. Walk away." For a long moment, the two men stared at each other, and Lily could feel the violence hovering in the air like heat shimmer. Then Riley spat into the dust and turned away, his friends following. "Ain't worth my time," he muttered, but everyone knew he'd back down. Xavier turned to Lily and she expected to see anger or judgment in his face. Instead, there was only concern. "You all right? I don't need you fighting my battles," she said, but the words lacked heat. Her hands were shaking, adrenaline draining away and leaving her feeling weak. Didn't fight anything, just diffused a situation that wouldn't have ended well for anyone. He gently took her elbow, guiding her away from the saloon. "Come on, let's get you home." She wanted to protest, to assert her independence, but the truth was she felt shaken in a way she hadn't expected. Confronting Riley had seemed so necessary in the moment, but now she could see how foolish it had been. What had she thought would happen? That he'd break down and confess? That justice would suddenly materialize after 2 years? They rode back to her ranch in silence, Xavier leading the way on his gray gelding while Lily followed on her bay mare. The sun was setting by the time they arrived, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that would have been beautiful if Lily had been in any state to appreciate them. Xavier helped her unsaddle her horse and store her supplies, moving through her barn like he'd been there 100 times. When the work was done, Lily finally found her voice. "Thank you for what you did in town. You don't need to thank me. I do, though." She sat down on a bale of hay, suddenly exhausted. "I was stupid to confront Riley like that. When I heard him talking about Thomas, saying those things. I understand." Xavier sat down on another bale, giving her space but staying close enough to talk. "Grief makes us do things we wouldn't normally do. It's been 2 years. People keep telling me I should be over it by now. People say a lot of foolish things. There's no timeline for grief." Lily looked at him, really looked at him for the first time. In the fading light, she could see lines around his eyes, marks of age and experience. There was a steadiness to him, a calm she found both frustrating and oddly comforting. "You said you knew something about loss. What did you lose?" Xavier was quiet for a long moment, and Lily thought he might not answer. Then he said, "My parents and younger sister. Cholera back in Kansas in '76. I was 20 then, thought I was grown. Learned real quick I wasn't. After they died, I just drifted. Worked wherever I could, never staying long. Ended up in Arizona Territory 3 years back and figured it was as good a place as any to stop drifting." "I'm sorry," Lily said, and meant it. "Like you said, sorry doesn't bring them back." He smiled slightly, but there was sadness in it. "But somewhere along the way, I realized that closing myself off to everything didn't honor their memory. Living, really living, that's what they would have wanted for me." "Is that what you think I'm doing? Closing myself off?" "I think you're surviving the best way you know how, but surviving isn't the same as living." His words hit her like a physical blow, not because they were cruel but because they were true. She had been surviving, nothing more, moving through each day with mechanical efficiency but no joy, no hope, no connection. She'd convinced herself that was strength, that refusing to let anyone in was protecting herself from more pain. But maybe it was just another kind of death. "I don't know how to do anything else," she admitted quietly. "That's all right. You don't have to figure it all out today." Xavier stood, testing his weight on his bad leg. "But maybe you could start by accepting that you don't have to carry everything alone. People want to help, Lily. Not because they pity you, but because that's what people do. They help each other." It was the first time he'd used her given name, and the sound of it in his voice sent an unexpected warmth through her chest. She stood as well, following him out of the barn. At his horse, he paused and looked back at her. "I'll come by in a few days to check on you if that's all right." "You don't have to," Lily said automatically, but then added, "But I wouldn't mind if you did." The smile he gave her was genuine and reached his eyes, transforming his face from merely pleasant to something approaching handsome. "Then I will. Good night, Lily." "Good night, Xavier." She watched him ride off into the gathering darkness, then walked slowly back to her house. For the first time in 2 years, the silence inside didn't feel quite so oppressive. She lit a lamp, prepared a simple supper, and sat at her small table eating while her thoughts circled around the events of the day. Confronting Riley had been foolish, but it had also been cathartic in a strange way. And Xavier's intervention, his quiet defense of her, had touched something she'd thought was dead inside her. The next few weeks brought a shift in the rhythm of Lily's life. Xavier began stopping by more regularly, always with some practical purpose. Checking the fence line, helping move cattle, fixing a loose shingle on her roof. But the visits stretched longer, the conversations deepened, and Lily found herself looking forward to the sound of hoofbeats that announced his arrival. They worked together easily, falling into a partnership that felt natural despite her initial resistance. November brought cooler temperatures and occasional rain that turned the desert briefly green. Lily's small garden flourished, and she found herself making extra food, telling herself it was just practical meal preparation. but knowing it had more to do with the fact that Xavier often stayed for supper now. They talked about everything and nothing. The weather, the cattle, stories from their pasts, dreams for the future. Xavier never pushed, never demanded more than she was willing to give, but his presence was like sunlight gradually melting ice that had formed around her heart. One evening in late November, as they sat on her porch watching the sunset, Xavier said, "The Ross family invited me to Thanksgiving dinner next week. They said I could bring a guest if I wanted. Would you like to come?" Lily's first instinct was to refuse. The thought of sitting at a table full of people, making conversation, pretending to be grateful when she'd spent 2 years cultivating her bitterness, it all felt overwhelming. But then she looked at Xavier, at the hope in his face carefully tempered with acceptance that she might say no, and found herself saying, "Yes, I'd like that." The surprise and pleasure in his smile made something flutter in her chest, something she'd thought was dead and buried alongside Thomas. It frightened her, that flutter, because it felt like a betrayal. But it also felt like waking up after a long, cold sleep. Thanksgiving arrived clear and bright, the kind of perfect day that made the harsh desert seem almost benevolent. Lily dressed carefully, wearing one of her better dresses that she'd kept packed away since Thomas died. It was dark blue calico, simple but flattering, and as she pinned up her hair in a style more elaborate than her usual practical braid, she barely recognized the woman looking back at her from the mirror. She looked younger somehow, the hard lines around her mouth softened, something like life returning to her eyes. Xavier arrived right on time, and the look he gave her when she opened the door made her blush. "You look beautiful," he said simply, no flowery words or exaggeration, just honest appreciation. "Thank you. You clean up well yourself." And he did, wearing what were clearly his best clothes, his hair neatly combed, his face freshly shaved. The Ross ranch was larger than Lily's spread, with a proper ranch house and several outbuildings. The family welcomed them warmly. Samuel and Martha Ross, married for 30 years, and their 3 grown children with their own spouses and kids. The house was full of noise and laughter, the kind of family chaos that Lily had once dreamed of having with Thomas. Being in the midst of it should have hurt, should have reminded her of everything she'd lost. Instead, she found herself relaxing, even laughing at the children's antics and joining in the women's conversations about preserving vegetables and the best way to keep chickens laying through winter. Dinner was a feast. Roasted turkey, potatoes, cornbread, green beans, and pie made from dried apples. Lily hadn't realized how hungry she was, not just for food but for this, for community and connection and the simple warmth of being around people who cared. Xavier sat beside her, occasionally catching her eye and smiling, his presence a steady anchor in the sea of new faces and conversations. After dinner, the men gathered outside to smoke and talk cattle while the women cleaned up. Martha Ross, a plump woman with kind eyes and silver-streaked hair, worked alongside Lily at the wash basin. "It's good to see Xavier bringing someone around," she said conversationally. "He's been alone too long, that one. A good man, but too much solitude isn't healthy." "We're just friends," Lily said automatically. Martha gave her a knowing look. "Friends is how it starts, dear. But I've seen the way he looks at you and the way you look at him when you think no one's watching. Nothing wrong with finding happiness again. Your husband wouldn't want you to be alone forever." Lily's hand stilled in the soapy water. "You didn't know Thomas. You don't know what he would want." "No, but I know what any person who truly loved someone would want, for them to live, to be happy, to find joy again. Love isn't diminished by loving again. The heart has room for more than one person." The words stayed with Lily as they rode home that evening, Xavier's horse keeping pace with hers in the moonlight. They'd both had perhaps a bit too much of Samuel Ross's apple cider, which may have been harder than advertised, and the world had taken on a pleasant soft focus quality. When they reached her ranch, Xavier dismounted to help her down, his hands spanning her waist as he lifted her from the saddle. She was suddenly very aware of his proximity, of the warmth of his hands, of the way he was looking at her in the silvery light. "I had a wonderful time today," she said softly. "Thank you for inviting me. I'm glad you came. I was afraid you'd say no. I almost did." She looked up at him, searching his face. "Xavier, why do you keep coming around? Really?" He didn't answer immediately, his hand still resting on her waist. When he spoke, his voice was low and honest. At first, it was just neighborly concern. "You looked so alone, so determined to push everyone away. I thought maybe I could help. But then I got to know you, saw your strength, your fierce independence, your kindness buried under all that anger. And I started coming around because being near you made me happy. Because I care about you, Lily." "More than I probably should." Her breath caught. "Xavier." "I'm not asking for anything," he said quickly. "I know you're not ready. Maybe you'll never be ready, and that's all right. I just wanted you to know so you wouldn't think I was only here out of pity or obligation." Lily's heart was pounding so hard she thought he must be able to hear it. 2 years of bitterness warred with the warmth blooming in her chest. 2 years of telling herself she'd never love again versus the undeniable pull she felt toward this patient, gentle man. "I'm scared," she whispered. "I know. I don't know if I can do this, if I can let someone in again. I know that too." He lifted one hand from her waist to cup her cheek, his touch feather light. "There's no rush, Lily. I'm not going anywhere." She leaned into his touch without thinking, her eyes closing. When she opened them again, he was closer, and the question in his eyes was clear. In answer, she rose onto her toes and kissed him, just a brief press of lips that lasted only a moment. But in that moment, something inside her broke open, all the grief and anger and loneliness pouring out and leaving space for something new. When she pulled back, tears were streaming down her face. Xavier pulled her against his chest, holding her while she cried, 2 years of pent-up emotion finally finding release. He didn't speak, didn't offer platitudes or try to fix anything. He just held her, solid and warm and patient as always. When her tears finally subsided, he walked her to her door, kissed her forehead gently, and mounted his horse. "I'll come by tomorrow," he said. "If that's all right." "I'd like that," Lily managed, her voice rough from crying. She watched him ride away, then went inside and lit a lamp. The house no longer felt quite so empty. That night, for the first time since Thomas died, she slept without nightmares. Winter settled over the desert, bringing cold nights and occasional frost that made the mornings sparkle like diamonds. Xavier came by almost daily now, and the nature of their relationship had shifted into something neither of them named but both understood. They were courting, in the old-fashioned sense, building something careful and real between them. He never pressured her for more than she was willing to give, content to simply be near her, to talk and work and share meals. Lily found herself changing in ways both small and profound. She smiled more, laughed at Xavier's dry humor, took care with her appearance not out of vanity but because she wanted to. The bitterness that had been her constant companion began to fade, not disappearing entirely but losing its sharp edges. She would always carry the grief of losing Thomas, always have that scar on her heart. But she was learning that scars didn't have to define her entire existence. December brought preparations for Christmas, and Martha Ross invited both Lily and Xavier to join their family for the holiday. This time, Lily accepted without hesitation. She even found herself baking cookies and making small gifts, activities she hadn't bothered with since Thomas died. The day before Christmas, as she and Xavier decorated her small house with pine branches they'd cut in the mountains, she realized she was happy. Actually, genuinely happy in a way she'd thought she'd never be again. "What are you thinking about?" Xavier asked, noticing her expression. "I'm thinking about how much things have changed, how much I've changed." She secured a branch above the doorway, then turned to him. 6 months ago, if someone had told me I'd be decorating for Christmas with you, looking forward to the holiday, I would have laughed at them. Or more likely snapped at them. "You were pretty prickly when we first met," Xavier agreed with a grin. "I was half afraid you'd shoot me that first day." "I considered it," Lily admitted, returning his grin. "You were very presumptuous, fixing my fence without permission. And you were very stubborn, refusing to admit you needed help." He set down the branch he was holding and crossed to her, pulling her into his arms. This had become familiar too, these embraces, the comfort of being held. They'd shared many kisses since that first one on Thanksgiving, but they'd gone no further, both understanding that Lily needed time to fully heal before taking that step. "I'm still stubborn," she said, resting her head against his chest. "I wouldn't want you any other way." He kissed the top of her head. "Lily, there's something I need to ask you." She pulled back to look up at him, noting the seriousness in his expression. "What is it?" "The Ross family is expanding their operation, bringing in more cattle. They need an additional foreman, someone to oversee the western section of their range. They offered me the position. It comes with better pay and a house on the property." Lily's stomach dropped. "You're leaving?" "That depends on you." He took both her hands in his. "I told them I'd need time to think about it, to discuss it with someone important. The truth is, I don't want to leave here. I don't want to leave you. But I also know I can't keep working as a regular hand forever. This is a good opportunity, a chance to build something more stable." "Then you should take it," Lily said, trying to keep her voice steady even as her heart was breaking. She'd known this was temporary, that eventually he'd move on, that she had no claim on him despite Lily. Xavier interrupted her spiraling thoughts. "I haven't finished. I told them I'd only accept under one condition, that there's room enough in that house for a wife." Time seemed to stop. Lily stared at him, not quite believing what she was hearing. "Are you asking me to marry you, not officially?" "Not yet." He squeezed her hands gently. "I know it's too soon, that you might not be ready. But I wanted you to know my intentions are serious. I want a future with you, Lily. I want to build a life together, to wake up next to you every morning, to grow old watching sunsets from our porch. I love you. I've probably loved you since you pointed that rifle at me over a dead coyote." Tears were flowing down her face again, but these were different from the grief-stricken tears of months past. These were tears of joy mixed with lingering fear, of hope struggling against old pain. "I love you too," she whispered. "I didn't want to. I fought against it so hard, but I do, Xavier, I love you. Then marry me. Not today, not tomorrow if you're not ready, but someday when you can say yes without fear or doubt. I'll wait as long as it takes." Lily thought about Thomas, about the life they'd planned that never came to be. She thought about the 2 years she'd spent wrapped in bitterness, convinced that her chance at happiness had died with her husband. And she thought about Martha Ross's words, "The heart has room for more than one person." Loving Xavier didn't diminish what she'd felt for Thomas. It was simply a different love, built on different foundations, and it was real and precious and worth fighting for. "Yes," she said. Xavier blinked. "Yes. Yes, I'll marry you, not someday, not eventually. I'll marry you, Xavier Ingram." She laughed at his shocked expression. "You said you'd wait as long as it takes. Well, it's taken long enough. I spent 2 years being bitter and alone, and I'm done with that. I want to live again, to love again. I want to build that future with you." The kiss he gave her was different from all the others. deeper and more passionate, full of promise and hope. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, Xavier picked her up and spun her around, his bad leg be damned, laughing with pure joy. Lily clung to him, laughing too, feeling lighter than she had in years. They were married 2 weeks later in a small ceremony at the church in Gila Bend. Martha Ross served as Lily's attendant, and Samuel stood up for Xavier. The church ladies who'd clucked over the bitter widow for 2 years now smiled with satisfaction, as if they'd orchestrated the whole thing. Even Mrs. Morrison dabbed at her eyes during the vows. Lily wore a simple cream-colored dress, and Xavier wore his best suit, and when the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, the kiss they shared was witnessed by half the town and sealed a promise both of them intended to keep. The house that came with Xavier's new position as foreman was small but sturdy, with 2 bedrooms, a real kitchen, and a porch that looked out over the desert toward the mountains. They spent their first weeks as a married couple making it their own, combining Lily's belongings with Xavier's sparse possessions and creating a home that belonged to both of them. Lily sold her small ranch to a young couple just starting out, using the money to buy cattle and supplies for their new life. Their first winter as husband and wife was cold but happy. They worked together managing the western section of the Ross Ranch, their partnership in work translating seamlessly to partnership in marriage. Xavier was patient with Lily's occasional dark moods, the days when grief would unexpectedly swamp her. He never took it personally, never demanded she simply get over it. He just held her when she needed holding, gave her space when she needed space, and loved her through it all with a steadiness that amazed her. For her part, Lily learned to be open in ways she'd never been before. She told Xavier about Thomas, about their marriage, about the dreams they'd had and the sudden violence that had ended everything. She cried in his arms over the injustice of it all, the fact that Jack Riley had never faced real consequences for taking a life. Xavier listened without judgment, and when she was done, he just said, "Thomas must have been a good man to have earned your love. I'm grateful he taught you how to love, even though I'm sorry for how it ended." Spring came to the desert in an explosion of wildflowers, and Lily realized with a start that she'd missed her monthly courses twice. She waited another month to be certain, then told Xavier one evening as they sat on their porch watching the sunset. His reaction was everything she could have hoped for, shock giving way to joy, picking her up and spinning her carefully, then immediately setting her down and asking if spinning was safe for the baby. "I'm pregnant, not made of glass," Lily laughed, but she was touched by his concern. "When?" he asked, his hand immediately going to her still flat stomach. "Late September or early October, I think. We're going to be parents, Xavier." The wonder on his face made her fall in love with him all over again. They spent that evening making plans, talking about names and whether they'd need to add onto the house and what kind of parents they wanted to be. Lily felt Thomas's absence in these conversations, the shadow of the life she'd planned with him overlaying this new reality. But the grief was gentler now, more wistful than bitter. She could be grateful for what she'd had while also embracing what she had now. The pregnancy progressed smoothly through the hot summer months. Lily continued working as long as she could, though Xavier fussed over her constantly, trying to make her rest and take it easy. She humored him when she could and ignored him when she couldn't, finding a balance between his protectiveness and her independence. The Ross family was excited about the coming baby, Martha knitting blankets and offering advice, while the younger Ross women shared their own experiences of pregnancy and childbirth. In late September, as the summer heat finally began to break, Lily went into labor. Martha Ross and the local midwife, a capable woman named Mrs. Chen, attended her while Xavier paced outside, his limp more pronounced due to anxiety. The labor was long and difficult, lasting through the night and into the following afternoon. There were moments when Lily was certain she couldn't continue, when the pain seemed too much to bear. But then she'd hear Xavier's voice through the door, calling encouragement, telling her how strong she was, how much he loved her, and she'd find the strength to push forward. Their son was born as the sun was setting, his first cries filling the small house with life. He was perfect, with Xavier's amber eyes and a shock of dark hair, his tiny fists waving indignantly at being thrust into the world. When Martha placed him in Lily's arms, she felt a love so fierce it took her breath away. This tiny person, this perfect blend of her and Xavier, was a new beginning, proof that life continued, that joy could follow sorrow. Xavier was allowed in moments later, and the look on his face when he saw his son made Lily's eyes fill with tears. He sat carefully on the edge of the bed, touching the baby's tiny hand with one finger, overwhelmed by the reality of fatherhood. "He's so small," Xavier whispered in awe. "He won't stay that way long," Mrs. Chen said with a smile. "That's a healthy baby boy you've got there. What are you going to name him?" Lily and Xavier had discussed names throughout the pregnancy but never settled on anything definitively. Now, looking at her son, Lily suddenly knew. "Thomas," she said softly. "His name is Thomas." Xavier looked at her in surprise. "Are you sure? I thought we'd agreed on James or Michael." "I'm sure." Lily stroked her son's soft cheek. "My first husband deserves to be remembered, and this little one deserves to carry forward a good man's name." "Thomas Xavier Ingram." "Thomas Xavier," Xavier repeated, testing the sound. Then he smiled, understanding and appreciation in his eyes. "It's perfect." The first months of parenthood were exhausting and wonderful in equal measure. Thomas was a good baby, healthy and strong, though he had his father's stubbornness when it came to sleeping through the night. Lily and Xavier took turns walking him, singing soft lullabies, marveling at every tiny milestone. His first smile, the first time he grasped Xavier's finger, the way he'd quiet when he heard his mother's voice. They settled into their new life as a family, the rhythm of work and childcare becoming familiar. Xavier proved to be a devoted father, changing diapers without complaint, walking the floor at 2 in the morning, talking to his son about cattle and horses, even though the baby was too young to understand. Lily watched her husband with their child and fell in love with him all over again, seeing depths of tenderness she'd only glimpsed before. The Ross family embraced little Thomas as if he were their own grandchild, the women constantly offering to watch him so Lily could rest, the men already planning to teach him to ride when he was older. It was the family Lily had dreamed of, not the exact shape she'd imagined, but real and loving and hers. One afternoon in December, when Thomas was 3 months old, Lily made a trip into Gila Bend for supplies. She left the baby with Martha, who was delighted to babysit, and rode into town with a list of items they needed. The weather was cool but pleasant, and she was humming to herself as she tied her horse outside the general store. She was loading her purchases into her saddlebags when a familiar voice made her freeze. Well, if it isn't Mrs. Stanton, or is it Mrs. Ingram now? Hard to keep track when a woman remarries so quick after being widowed. Jack Riley stood behind her, and the sneer in his voice was unmistakable. Lily turned slowly, her hand instinctively going to the pistol at her hip. The grief and rage she'd felt 2 years ago when confronting him outside the saloon was gone, replaced by a cold clarity. This man had taken her husband from her, had stolen the life she'd planned, and he'd never faced justice for it. But she also remembered the foolishness of that previous confrontation. the way she'd let anger drive her into a dangerous situation. She was different now, stronger in ways that had nothing to do with bitterness. "It's Mrs. Ingram," she said evenly. "And it's been 3 years since my first husband died. Not that my mourning period is any of your business. 3 years and you've got a new husband and a baby." Riley took a step closer, and she could smell whiskey on his breath. "That was quick work. Makes a man wonder if maybe you had Ingram waiting in the wings all along." "Careful, Riley." Lily's voice dropped to something dangerous. "You're talking about my husband and about me. Neither of which concerns you." "Everything about you concerned me once," Riley said, his voice turning ugly. "Your husband cheated at cards, drew on me when I called him out on it. That's the truth, no matter what stories you tell yourself." Lily felt the old rage rising but pushed it down. Getting into a confrontation with a drunk Riley in the middle of town would help nothing. She finished loading her supplies and turned to mount her horse, intending to simply leave. But Riley grabbed her arm, spinning her around. "I'm talking to you, woman." The moment his hand touched her, Lily reacted on instinct. She drove her elbow into his stomach, making him double over with a grunt, then brought her knee up into his face. Riley went down hard, blood streaming from his nose, cursing and flailing. Lily stood over him, her hand on her pistol, breathing hard. "Don't you ever put your hands on me again," she said coldly. "My first husband may have been slow on the draw, but I'm not. Next time you touch me, I'll put a bullet in you and call it self-defense, just like you did." She mounted her horse and rode away without looking back, her heart pounding. Several townspeople had witnessed the confrontation, and by the time she made it home, she was shaking with reaction. Xavier took one look at her face and pulled her into his arms, holding her while she told him what had happened. "Are you all right?" he asked when she finished. "Did he hurt you?" "I'm fine." More angry than anything. She pulled back to look at him. "I'm not that bitter widow anymore, Xavier. I've moved on, built a new life. But when he grabbed me, when he spoke about Thomas that way, I just reacted." "Good," Xavier said firmly. "You defended yourself. That's exactly what you should have done. And if Riley comes around here looking for trouble, he'll have me to deal with." But Riley didn't come around. Word spread through Gila Bend about how the widow Ingram had laid out Jack Riley in the middle of town, and the general consensus was that he'd had it coming. The incident became a sort of final closing chapter on that part of Lily's life. She'd faced down her husband's killer, proven she could defend herself, and walked away stronger for it. The bitterness she'd carried for so long finally fully released its hold on her. The years that followed were good ones. Thomas grew into a sturdy toddler, then a rambunctious boy, with his father's calm nature and his mother's fierce independence. When he was 2, Lily gave birth to a daughter they named Sarah Martha, after no one in particular but with a middle name honoring Martha Ross. Sarah had Lily's blonde hair and Xavier's amber eyes, and she was her father's heart from the moment she drew breath. Xavier proved as devoted a father to 2 children as he had been to one, somehow managing to give each of them individual attention despite his long work hours. He taught Thomas to ride almost as soon as the boy could walk, patient as always when dealing with scraped knees and childish frustration. He was gentler with Sarah, but no less invested, singing her lullabies in his rough voice and letting her fall asleep on his chest after long days. Lily watched her family grow and flourish, and sometimes in quiet moments, she'd think about the bitter widow she'd been. That woman seemed like a stranger now, someone she could barely recognize. The grief of losing Thomas Stanton would always be part of her story, but it no longer defined her entire existence. She'd learned that loving again didn't diminish what she'd had before. The heart did indeed have room for more than one person, and the capacity to heal even from devastating loss. One evening when Thomas was 5 and Sarah was 3, the family sat on their porch watching the sunset, a ritual they'd maintained since the children were born. Xavier held Sarah in his lap, while Thomas sat pressed against his mother's side, asking endless questions about the desert animals they could see in the fading light. Lily leaned against her husband's shoulder, content in a way she'd never thought possible during those dark months after losing her first husband. "What are you thinking about?" Xavier asked softly, the question he'd been asking her for years. "I'm thinking about how lucky I am," Lily said honestly. "I almost let bitterness destroy me. If you hadn't been so patient, if you hadn't kept coming around despite how awful I was to you, I might still be alone in that little ranch, angry at the world. You weren't awful. You were hurting." "I was bitter," Lily corrected. "The title fit, but you saw past that, saw something in me worth waiting for. I'll never understand why, but I'll always be grateful. I saw a woman who loved so deeply that losing that love nearly broke her," Xavier said. "I saw strength wrapped in anger, beauty hidden behind grief. And I saw someone worth waiting for, worth being patient with. I'd wait 100 years if that's what it took." Lily kissed him, a soft press of lips that spoke of years of partnership and love. The children giggled at their parents' display of affection, and Sarah squirmed in Xavier's lap until he released her to go chase lizards with her brother in the yard. They sat in comfortable silence, watching their children play in the cooling evening air. The desert stretched out before them in shades of purple and gold, harsh but beautiful, much like the journey that had brought them together. Lily thought about all the twists and turns of life, the losses and gains, the grief and joy that somehow coexisted in the human experience. "Thomas would have liked you," she said suddenly. "My first Thomas, I mean. He would have approved of the man taking care of his widow." Xavier squeezed her hand. "I'd like to think so. He clearly had good taste in women." Lily laughed, then grew serious. "I want our children to know about him, about their namesake. I don't want his memory to fade." "We'll make sure they know," Xavier promised. "They'll grow up hearing stories about Thomas Stanton, about the life you had before, about how grief and love can coexist. It's part of their history, part of what made their mother into the strong woman she is." As the last light faded from the sky and the stars began to emerge, Xavier called the children back to the porch. They went inside together, a family united by love and patience and the hard work of healing. That night, after the children were tucked into bed, Xavier and Lily lay together in their own bed, comfortable in the darkness. "Do you ever regret it?" Lily asked quietly. "Taking on a bitter widow with so much baggage?" "Never," Xavier answered immediately. "You're the best thing that ever happened to me, Lily Ingram. Every moment of patience was worth it to get here, to this life with you." She curled into his embrace, listening to the steady beat of his heart. Outside, coyotes called to each other across the desert, the same wild sound she'd heard that morning years ago when she shot the coyote threatening her chickens. So much had changed since then. She'd changed, transformed from a bitter widow into a woman who knew how to love again, how to open her heart despite the risk of pain. The years continued to pass in the way years do, marked by small moments and significant milestones. Thomas started school in Gila Bend, riding into town with his father each morning and showing a quick mind for numbers and letters. Sarah proved to be fearless, climbing trees and chasing cattle, and giving her parents more than a few gray hairs with her adventures. They were good children, happy and loved, growing up in a home full of warmth despite the harsh desert surrounding them. When Thomas was 8 and Sarah was 6, Lily discovered she was pregnant again. This pregnancy was harder than the previous 2, perhaps because she was now 32 and chasing after 2 active children while managing household and ranch duties. Xavier tried to make her rest more, but Lily was too stubborn to slow down completely. In the spring, she gave birth to twin boys, a complete surprise as twins didn't run in either family. They named the twins Daniel and Robert, and suddenly the small house felt very crowded indeed. Xavier worked with Samuel Ross to add 2 more rooms, expanding their home to accommodate their growing family. The older children were fascinated by their baby brothers, Thomas taking his role as oldest very seriously, and Sarah proving to be a surprisingly gentle helper despite her typically rough and tumble nature. Life with 4 children was chaotic and exhausting and full of joy. Xavier continued to be patient, never complaining about the noise or the mess or the constant demands on their time. He was the kind of father who came home after long days working cattle and still had energy to play with his children, to answer their questions, to tuck them into bed with stories. Lily sometimes marveled at the path her life had taken. If someone had told that bitter widow standing over a dead coyote that in 10 years she'd have 4 children and be happily remarried, she would have laughed in their face or possibly shot them. But here she was, exhausted and happy, her heart so full it sometimes felt like it might burst. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Xavier arranged for Martha Ross to watch the children so he could take Lily on a picnic into the mountains. It was the first time they'd been truly alone together in months, and the silence felt almost strange after the constant noise of their household. They rode to a high meadow where wildflowers bloomed in profusion, spreading a blanket under a cottonwood tree. 10 years, Lily said wonderingly as they ate the lunch she'd packed. Has it really been that long? Feels like yesterday and a lifetime ago all at once, Xavier agreed. He stretched out on the blanket, his bad leg extended carefully. The old injury bothered him more these days, especially in cold weather, but he never complained. Lily lay down beside him, looking up at the sky through the leaves of the cottonwood. Do you remember what you said to me? That first time you really talked about us at Thanksgiving. I said a lot of things that night. You said you'd wait as long as it took, that you weren't going anywhere. She turned her head to look at him. You've kept that promise every day since, through my grief, my fear, my stubborn independence. You never pushed, never demanded, never made me feel like I owed you anything. That's what love is, Xavier said simply. Patience and understanding and being there even when it's hard. I wish I'd learned that lesson earlier, Lily admitted. I wasted so much time being bitter, pushing everyone away. If I'd let you in sooner, if I'd been willing to heal faster. Then we wouldn't be who we are now, Xavier interrupted gently. You needed that time, Lily. You needed to work through your grief at your own pace. If I'd rushed you, if I'd pushed for more before you were ready, we might not have made it. Everything happened exactly as it needed to. Lily considered this, then nodded. He was right, as he so often was. Her journey from bitter widow to happy wife and mother hadn't been quick or easy, but it had been necessary. She'd needed to hit rock bottom before she could start climbing back up. She'd needed to confront Jack Riley and her own anger before she could truly move forward. And she'd needed Xavier's patient, steady presence, his willingness to wait for her to be ready. I love you, she said. More than I thought it was possible to love someone. You saved me, Xavier. We saved each other, he corrected, pulling her close. I was drifting before I met you, just going through the motions of living. You gave me purpose, a reason to put down roots. We healed each other. They spent the afternoon in the meadow, talking and laughing and simply being together without the demands of children or work. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in brilliant colors, they packed up their picnic and rode home. The house was chaos when they arrived, Martha looking slightly frazzled from managing 4 children all day, but both parents felt refreshed from their time together. The children grew and changed, each developing their own distinct personalities. Thomas remained serious and studious, eventually expressing an interest in becoming a lawyer, much to everyone's surprise. Sarah was wild and free, more comfortable on horseback than anywhere else, declaring she'd be a rancher like her father. The twins were inseparable, finishing each other's sentences and getting into mischief together in ways their older siblings never had. Lily and Xavier aged together, gray appearing in their hair, lines deepening around their eyes and mouths. But they grew closer rather than apart, their partnership deepening with each passing year. They'd weathered hardships together. Drought years when the cattle struggled, illness that took several days of fever and fear before breaking, the normal challenges of raising children in the harsh desert environment. But they'd also celebrated triumphs. Good years when the cattle were fat and the prices high, watching their children grow and thrive. The simple joy of waking up next to each other every morning. When Thomas was 15, he came to his mother with questions about his namesake. He'd heard stories about Thomas Stanton before, but now he wanted to know more, to understand the man he was named after. Lily sat with her son on the porch and told him everything, about falling in love with Thomas Stanton, about their brief marriage, about the night he was killed and the years of bitterness that followed. "You still love him?" Thomas asked seriously. "Your first husband?" Lily considered the question carefully. "I'll always love the memory of who he was and what we had together, but that love is different now, softer, like a photograph that's faded with time. The love I have for your father is immediate and present and still growing. They're different types of love, and one doesn't diminish the other." "And you named me after him to remember," Thomas said, understanding in his young face. "I named you after him because he was a good man who deserved to be remembered. And because I wanted you to understand that love doesn't die just because a person does, that the heart has infinite capacity for love if we're brave enough to open it." Thomas thought about this, then nodded. "I'm glad you married Pa. I'm glad you let yourself love again." "So am I, sweetheart." "So am I." Years continued their steady march forward, bringing change and growth. Thomas went off to study law in Phoenix, writing letters home that his parents read and reread until they were worn thin. Sarah took over more responsibilities on the ranch, proving to have a natural gift for managing cattle and horses. The twins, now in their teens, worked alongside their father and sister, learning the business that would someday be theirs. Lily was 45 when Samuel Ross died peacefully in his sleep, leaving the ranch to his children with the provision that Xavier remain as foreman for as long as he wished. The funeral was well attended, a testament to the man's character, and afterward, Martha Ross came to stay with Lily and Xavier for a few weeks while she adjusted to widowhood. Watching Martha grieve, Lily was transported back to her own widowhood, to those dark days when she thought she'd never feel whole again. But she could also see the difference that made all the difference. Martha had her children around her, her friends, her community. She wasn't alone in her grief, and while the pain was real, it didn't consume her the way it had consumed Lily all those years ago. One evening, as the two women sat on the porch shelling peas while Xavier and the twins worked nearby, Martha said, "You know, I remember when you first came to Thanksgiving dinner all those years ago. You were so closed off, so determined not to let anyone in. And I remember thinking that Xavier had his work cut out for him if he wanted to win your heart." "He was very patient," Lily said with a smile. "The best ones always are," Martha agreed. "Samuel was patient with me too in the early days. I was so young and foolish, thought I knew everything about love. He taught me that love is work, daily work, but the kind of work that makes you better rather than wearing you down. I'm sorry you lost him, Lily said softly. I know that pain. I know you do, dear. But I also know what comes after because I've watched you these past 15 years. The pain eases. It never disappears completely, but it becomes manageable. And life continues, full of love and joy if we're open to receiving it. Martha reached over and patted Lily's hand. Thank you for showing me that all those years ago, even if you didn't realize you were doing it. Martha eventually returned to her own home, supported by her children and grandchildren, and life at the Ingram Ranch returned to its normal rhythm. But the conversation stayed with Lily, making her reflect on the journey she'd taken from bitter widow to the woman she was now. So much had changed, and yet in some ways, she was still that same person, just healed and whole instead of broken and bitter. On a cool evening in November, 20 years after they'd first married, Lily and Xavier sat on their porch watching yet another sunset. The children were grown now. Thomas was a successful lawyer in Phoenix, married with a baby on the way. Sarah ran her own small ranch with her husband, a cowboy she'd met at a cattle auction. The twins, now 18, still lived at home and worked the ranch, though they talked about eventually starting their own operation. 20 years, Xavier said, echoing Lily's words from their 10th anniversary. Somehow it's gone by faster than the first 10. That's because we've been happy, Lily said, leaning against his shoulder. His hair was mostly gray now, and his bad leg bothered him more than he admitted, but he was still the steady, patient man she'd fallen in love with. Time moves quickly when you're not counting the days until they're over. Do you ever think about what your life would have been like if we hadn't met? Xavier asked. If I hadn't been working the Ross Ranch, if I hadn't heard that shot and come to check on you. Lily considered this. I try not to think about it. That path leads to a dark place, I think. A bitter widow growing old alone, probably dead from stubbornness and isolation before she hit 40. You saved my life, Xavier, in every way a person can be saved. And you gave me a reason to have a life worth living, Xavier countered. We saved each other. We'll keep saving each other until the end. They sat in comfortable silence as the stars began to emerge, the same stars that had witnessed their courtship, their wedding, the birth of their children, and every significant moment of their lives together. The desert stretched out before them, harsh and beautiful, a fitting metaphor for the journey they'd traveled together. You remember what you said to me that first Thanksgiving? Lily asked. When I asked why you kept coming around, I said I cared about you, that being near you made me happy. And you said there was no rush, that I should take all the time I needed. She turned to look at him, seeing the love in his amber eyes that had never faded. Thank you for being patient with me, for waiting until I could love again. It was the easiest thing I've ever done, Xavier said honestly. Because you were worth every moment of waiting. You still are. Lily kissed him as the last light faded from the sky, a kiss that held 20 years of love and partnership and patience. When they finally pulled apart, both were smiling, content in the life they'd built together from the ashes of grief and loss. The years that followed brought the natural progression of life. More grandchildren, the twins eventually marrying and starting families of their own, the slow process of aging that came for everyone eventually. Xavier's leg grew worse, and he finally had to give up active ranch work, transitioning to more of an advisory role. Lily developed arthritis in her hands, making some tasks difficult, but she refused to slow down completely. They celebrated their 30th anniversary surrounded by children and grandchildren, a noisy, joyful gathering that filled their expanded home to bursting. Looking around at the family they'd created, Lily felt a profound sense of gratitude. She'd been given a second chance at happiness, and she'd taken it, despite her fear and bitterness. That decision had led to all of this. The laughter of grandchildren, the love of grown children who were now building lives of their own, the steady presence of the man who'd been patient enough to wait for her healing. As the party wound down and the guests began to leave, Xavier pulled Lily aside to the porch, their sanctuary through so many years. The November air was crisp and cool, carrying the scent of mesquite smoke from nearby chimneys. 30 years, he said, shaking his head in wonder. Feels like we're just getting started. We are, Lily assured him. We have years left, Xavier Ingram, years of sunsets and grandchildren and growing old together. I'm holding you to that, he said with a smile. I plan to be sitting on this porch with you when we're both too old and deaf to hear each other, still watching these sunsets. It's a date, Lily promised, and she meant it with every fiber of her being. They did indeed have more years, good years full of the quiet satisfaction that comes from a life well lived. They watched their grandchildren grow, welcomed great-grandchildren into the world, and celebrated anniversaries until they lost count of which one they were on. Xavier's health declined gradually, his old injuries and hard life of work taking their toll, but his mind remained sharp, and his love for Lily never wavered. When Lily was 68 and Xavier was 71, he died peacefully in their bed one autumn morning, Lily holding his hand as he slipped away. The grief was real and sharp, but it was different from the grief she'd felt when Thomas Stanton died. This time, she wasn't alone. She had children and grandchildren surrounding her with love. She had a lifetime of happy memories to sustain her, and she had the knowledge that she'd loved and been loved completely. At Xavier's funeral, attended by what seemed like half of Arizona, Lily stood straight and dry-eyed, accepting condolences with grace. She told stories about her husband, about his patience and kindness and unwavering love. She didn't shy away from the grief but didn't let it consume her either. She'd learned that lesson long ago, paid for it in years of bitterness, and she wouldn't waste the wisdom that had cost her so much. After the funeral, as family gathered at her home, young Thomas, now a grandfather himself, sat beside his mother. "Are you all right, Ma?" he asked gently. "I will be," Lily said honestly. "I'm sad, of course. Your father was the love of my life, and I'll miss him every day, but I'm also grateful for every moment we had together. He taught me how to live again, how to love again. That's a gift I'll carry with me for whatever time I have left." "He was a good man." "The best," Lily agreed. "Patient and kind and steady as stone. He waited for me to heal, never pushed, never demanded. And then he spent 44 years showing me every single day that I'd made the right choice in opening my heart again." She lived for 3 more years after Xavier's death. Years she spent surrounded by family, sharing stories about both her husbands, both the loves of her life. She never remarried, content with the memories she'd made and the family she'd helped create. She died peacefully in her sleep at 71, and they buried her between her 2 husbands, Thomas Stanton on one side and Xavier Ingram on the other, a woman who'd loved twice and been loved completely in return. At her funeral, her children and grandchildren told stories about the bitter widow who'd learned to love again, about the patient cowboy who'd waited for her healing, about the beautiful life they'd built together from grief and patience and unwavering love. It was a story worth telling, a testament to the human capacity for healing and growth and finding joy even after devastating loss. The ranch continued on, passed down through generations of Ingrams, each one hearing the story of how it all began. With a rifle shot in the Arizona desert, a dead coyote, and a bitter widow who'd forgotten how to hope. They heard about Xavier's patience, his quiet determination to show Lily that life could be good again, that love could heal even the deepest wounds. And they heard about Lily's courage in letting go of her bitterness, in opening her heart despite the fear, in choosing to live rather than merely survive. It was a love story for the ages, set against the harsh beauty of the Wild West, a reminder that even in the hardest places and the darkest times, love could flourish if given patience and care. The bitter widow had learned to love again, and in doing so, had created a legacy that would last far longer than her mortal life. And on quiet evenings, when the wind blew across the desert and the sun painted the sky in brilliant colors, those who knew the story swore they could feel the presence of two souls still sitting together on that porch, still watching the sunset, still as in love as they'd been in life. Proof that true love never really ends. It just transforms into something eternal.